I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Jake.
I'm Rosie.
And today we're talking about Upstairs, Downstairs, which was produced by LWT for ITV from 1971 to 1975. The other big London weekend television produced success that we've talked about before is Gladiators. And Upstairs Downstairs is quite different from Gladiators in most ways. But one thing they do have in common is a certain amount of international success. As I said last time, Upstairs Downstairs was a successful export for ITV. It was enjoyed in continental Europe, but mainly in the United States of America. It's quite a common joke to say, oh yes, the Americans thought it was a documentary. It was showing you what life was actually like in the 1970s in a typical British household. Certainly you can hear Simon Williams reading that joke off also cue on a cast reunion. I first really became aware of it when our mother started watching repeats of it on ITV2 in the noughties. As it turned out, she and her mother, our granny, had watched this quite religiously when they lived together in the 70s and had enjoyed it very much. It had been a special show for them to settle down and watch every weekend, and our mum was quite pleased to find it again. I always think it must have been quite interesting for our granny, who lived through a lot of the events that are depicted in Upstairs Downstairs. The timeline runs between 1903 and 1930. Our granny was born in 1910 and grew up during the First World War and would have found a lot to relate to and find an interest in on a personal level. What really struck me about the show while our mum was watching it was that I could hear Fireman Sam. Surely, I thought, that's Fireman Sam on the telly, but what's this she's watching? Some 70s drama. But of course, it was Fireman Sam. It was one of the series 2 episodes heavily featuring Thomas and Sarah. And as I quickly discovered by looking it up on the internet, John Alderton, who isn't really Welsh, does play Thomas Watkins on Upstairs Downstairs and narrate the original Fireman Sam series from the 80s and 90s. And really, his Welsh accent as Thomas is his audition to do Fireman Sam, because to the untrained ear, it just sounds like Fireman Sam is on the telly. I was struck by the fact that John Alderton and Pauline Collins, who played Sarah, had some good on-screen chemistry, so I was interested to read that they were actually married in real life. While Upstairs Downstairs was being made, they were married in 1969. They were still married when our mum was watching the repeats in the noughties, and as we are recording this podcast in the closing stages of 2023, they are still married. There'll be more to say about Thomas and Sarah later, but the conclusion of this particular personal story is that I arranged for all the DVDs of Upstairs Downstairs to come to our house from Amazon, and I think our mum enjoyed watching them more than she expected to. She just kind of came across the repeat and was pleased to see it, but didn't particularly think any more about it until I gave her these DVDs, and then she got very into it, and we all started watching it and became very engaged by it. You can see from the design of the title with the linked U and D at the beginning of the two words, the intention of the show is to show upstairs and downstairs in the big house with the toffs upstairs and the servants downstairs, and also to show how, like the U and the D, those things connect and interact, which was something that hadn't really been done before.
Mum was telling me it was terribly groundbreaking and terribly original because servants had never been characters before.
And of course, like all the best things that turn out really well, that really work, that turn out to be quite clever, it's not a straightforward creative process to get to it. The original concept for the show that became Upstairs Downstairs came from Jean Marsh and Eileen Atkins wanting to play two maids and look at things from their point of view, which would kind of be breaking new ground. But then producer John Hawksworth, who we've noticed really does write the show the best, realised, well, let's not just have it about the servants, let's have it about the whole house. How do the two different strata function individually, and how does that have the knock-on effect to how they function together? And that's really what makes it so interesting. Watching Upstairs Downstairs through in preparation for this podcast, I was reminded of Quantum Leap more than I thought I would be. On the Quantum Leap podcast, I say that having just watched all 5 seasons through, I'm coming in to do the podcast feeling less fond of it than ever before. And actually, our Quantum Leap DVDs didn't make it to our new house. And I did think this time, watching Upstairs Downstairs, I'm kind of not enjoying it as much as I used to. But I can still see what makes it so good and so enjoyable. And I think if you do watch it for 13 weeks on Sunday nights every year for 5 years, you'd be infinitely satisfied with it, remember it very fondly, and that is the best way to engage with it, really. I mentioned how John Hawkesworth was the best writer. Some of the writing is really bad, and some of the episodes themselves, as a consequence, are weird, boring, difficult to watch, incongruous with other episodes. Some episodes are really good, and what makes the show work, of course, is, as ever, the actors. Sometimes, even in a really dire episode, a reliable, staunch, core group of actors are getting some good work done and making the most of the script, very much like Scott Bakula and Dean Stockwell managed to do on occasion in Quantum Leap. We were watching the first series when you were telling me all the actors in these roles work, do a good job, really bring the show to life very successfully. And I think that's very true, and that is what makes it work. I believe in the characters and their relationships, how they interact with each other and history, and so even though it's really badly written in places, it always kind of works in that way. Let's briefly think about our mainstay actors who do such a wonderful job throughout the 5 seasons. Wonderful Gordon Jackson as Hudson, really holding the whole show together, particularly downstairs. He has more appearances than anyone else, 60 episodes out of 68. Wonderful David Langton as Richard Bellamy upstairs, with 56 episodes, nearly as many as Hudson, a real linchpin for that side of the family, as it were. Very entertaining Angela Baddeley as Mrs. Bridges, always bringing something special to those kitchen scenes. Co-creator Jean Marsh as Rose. She's been mentioned on these podcasts before. Jean Marsh herself, as a guest villain in The Tomorrow People, and indeed Rose the character, who reminds me of Sue the panda in some ways, or one particular way, as was mentioned on the Sooty podcast. Simon Williams as James Bellamy. What a wonderful job he does of being a bored, disaffected, often grumpy career soldier, not quite knowing what to do with his life or how to be happy. And that's reminded me how I've been thinking, in some ways, the characters are kind of like the characters in The Thin Blue Line. What we said about them was they're kind of caricaturish and out there. Upstairs Downstairs characters aren't to the same extent caricaturish and out there, but they do embody certain aspects of certain archetypes of characters and make us laugh in that way or think in that way from time to time. And then, of course, there's Christopher Beanie as Edward, who's often quite annoying, not necessarily to watch, but certainly to the other characters, but over 5 series gets plenty of chances to show some interesting, different emotions and situations for the character, particularly during the First World War, of course.
One of the first things I noticed about Edward is that he is the most different upstairs and downstairs. His real personality, chatting up the maids, even feeling up the maids, gossiping about what's going on upstairs. The people who are upstairs never get any sense of that. He is extremely professional, straight-backed and quiet and polite, and knows what to say and what to do when he's actually doing his footman job.
Edward really does act that way to all the maids, starting with Emily, the first kitchen maid, when Edward first turns up, and ending up with Lily in Series 5, really, when Edward's probably old enough to be her father and should know much better.
And is married as well to Daisy, the, by then, head house parlour maid.
And what really struck me this time was Daisy is the first maid to react positively to this kind of attention that Edward gives all the maids, and so she's the one who marries him. Also in all 5 seasons we have guest appearances from Joan Benham as Lady Prudence Fairfax, who's always so useful if they need an upstairs woman around, particularly with their main mistresses of the house flitting in and out of the show at times. There are 3 of them, and they all prove elusive at times in their own ways. And then, of course, there's Raymond Huntley as family solicitor Sir Geoffrey Dillon, who's written as a very dry, fussy, matter-of-fact, clinical sort of lawyer, but Raymond Huntley couldn't help bringing such warmth and humanity to the role that he becomes an absolute indispensable family friend. And it takes until Hannah Gordon turns up in the second half of season 4 for a character to actually point out Sir Geoffrey Dillon pretends to be such an old fuddy-duddy, but really he's got a heart of gold. That's all thanks to the actor, what he put into the performance, how he crafted the character. Before we say a few words about each series, it's worth coming back to Eileen Atkins, who, as I mentioned, conceived the original idea for a show of this kind alongside Jean Marsh. As they imagined it at first, of course, they were going to play the 2 maids, and it's not surprising to read that the first thought of an actress to play Sarah was Eileen Atkins alongside Jean Marsh as Rose. This didn't come off. The other role that apparently was there for Eileen Atkins later in Series 1 as Lawrence Kerbridge's landlady, fancy woman, lover, or was she? Well, yes, she was actually. Also didn't end up being played by Eileen Atkins. I don't think she was that keen on being in the show in the end. To get it out of the way now, I'll just mention that Eileen Atkins finally did appear in Upstairs, Downstairs, the reboot in the 2010s with Keeley Hawes and
Laura Haddock, who was at Playgroup with me,
and various other people, making a complete nonsense of the end of the proper Upstairs, Downstairs, of course, where 165 Eaton Place is going to be sold for flats. The entire point there being that the world we've seen since 1903, servants, big households, is coming to an end, and it's not really going to be happening again at 165 Eaton Place with a new family between 1936 and 1939. Jean Marsh was in both series of that as Rose, running her own servant agency, and also becoming the housekeeper with the new household at 165 Eaton Place. And Eileen Atkins was in the first series of that as the mother-in-law character, Keeley Hawes' mother-in-law. But she declined to return for Series 2. So obviously she didn't really like that version of Upstairs, Downstairs either. Perhaps it never really came to life on the screen in a way that Eileen Atkins could really get to grips with, approve of. Thinking about the first series, it was there that I saw the best example of what I was saying about Rose and Sue, the panda from Sooty. Rose can very easily swap roles from very properly respecting, defending, not saying a word against Upstairs, or doing anything improper Mr. Hudson might not approve of, to laughing and joking along with the younger servants in a way that'll cause Mr. Hudson to have a fit at their behaviour. The episode is I Dies from Love, where Edward and Emily are peering out of the kitchen window up to the street, gossiping about the posh coach and the footman, and Rose comes in and tells them off, and then, of course, immediately starts joining in with them, making her look like a bit of a hypocrite. But she does kind of tread that line. The first series suffered a bit of a setback with one of the TV strikes that was going on at the time. Certain people felt that money shouldn't be spent on colour cameras, it should be given to the people actually making the television. There's nothing wrong with filming it in black and white. And so the first few episodes of Upstairs Downstairs are actually filmed in black and white. They came back at the very end of the series once they got their colour cameras and remade the first episode. Apparently the black and white copy of that no longer exists. But it is very important on a watch-through to have the black and white episodes, and the international markets that don't have them, have never been sold them, are actually missing several important pieces of continuity, like anything happening between James and Sarah, and Alfred, the original footman, running off with Count von Rimmer to be a gay couple. Unfortunately, not a very happy one in the end, as it turns out in season 3. And indeed it does take the show a few episodes to find its feet. But there are some particularly striking things about season 1. The episode I mentioned, I Dies from Love, has Emily, the kitchen maid, committing suicide, and it's a bit stupid, all that, putting too much hope in the young footman from the other household who gets very easily talked round by his manipulative mistress. But we were enjoying the bit that was funny and sad at the same time, where the rather tactless undertakers were waiting for their cart to turn up and sticking Emily's full coffin on the kitchen table, and Mr. Hudson was having to pass some cups of tea over it, and everyone was feeling very awkward about it. That sort of thing works in Upstairs, Downstairs. Relatable feelings, the highs and lows of life, presented in an entertaining way. Another big one in the first series is Why Is Her Door Locked? The one where Mrs. Bridges steals the baby. Of course, that's really a lot to do with her breaking down after Emily's suicide. And how does Mr. Hudson get Mrs. Bridges out of that trouble? He uses Baldrick's plan from Major Star in Blackadder Goes Forth.
My plan is that I will marry Mrs. Bridges in this case rather than General Melchett. Of course, that is the episode which refers to her being a widow and her dead husband, Bridges, which is quite incorrect, as Hudson tells Frank Middlemass in a much later episode. Mrs. is a courtesy title, and that version of events fits in with the backstory of Mrs. Bridges having been a kitchen maid at Southwold, the estate where Lady Marjorie grew up as the daughter of the Earl, and coming with her to Eaton Place, there's been no time to get married or indeed to be from Bristol. That writer is Alfred Shaughnessy. He really does have some trouble with continuity. That's his inferiority to John Hawksworth.
And he is the script editor, Alfred Shaughnessy, which may have damaged the show slightly in places. And indeed, as we were watching it through, we did agree that that was the main problem with the show. Lack of continuity, inconsistencies between writers, wasn't very good for making a tangible world, which is why it's better to forget all those details, watching it week by week over 5 years. Of course, Mr. Hudson does, over 20 years later, go through with his promise to marry Mrs. Bridges in the very final episode of Series 5. She becomes Mrs. Hudson, and they do have a very special relationship throughout the show, and indeed for many years before it, and probably after it. A kind of very gentle, mutual love and understanding, and great respect for the class system and the master-servant relationship. As I mentioned briefly, towards the end of Series 1, you get the Elizabeth Bellamy and Lawrence Kerbridge stuff kicking off. And this leads to a lot of continuity problems when we get to Season 2. But it does also kind of set Elizabeth up as the main source of storylines, strife, in Series 2, wanting to change the world for the better, but not wanting to lose her superiority over her servants because of it. There are striking bits that illustrate that, like when Elizabeth is telling Rose, "Oh, you should tell me if you're cross with me, Rose. You should tell me if you think I'm doing something wrong." And then, of course, when Rose says, "Oh, Miss Lizzie, you really are making a complete mess of everything for yourself and everyone else," Elizabeth is quick to say, "You've no right to say so, Rose, and should remember your place."
The whole thing between Elizabeth and Lawrence is very peculiar. They spend the whole of the last episode of series 1 saying we don't believe in marriage, we're not going to get married, and by the end they are getting married, and Elizabeth still doesn't really seem sure. And then for series 2 they're setting up home together and having Rose as their maid, Thomas as their everything really. They hire him as Lawrence's valet, but he agrees to do all sorts of other helping in the garden and fixing things and goodness knows what. And Mrs. Fellows, the cook, whose catchphrase is "not with my leg, I can't do this, I can't do that, not with my leg," which is funny the first couple of times, but soon wears rather thin. But they're also having their marital problems, and it seems to me they really didn't know whether they wanted to go on with Lawrence and Elizabeth or not. And I do wonder if the decision was made by some kind of focus group who agreed with me that Lawrence is really irritating. And it's not the actor, it's the character. He's a young poet and he's a socialist and he's terribly pretentious, and he kind of throws himself about and makes himself the centre of attention. One example I happen to remember is we were talking about Austria and I was terribly witty about lederhosen. He says things like that and it's very annoying, and I didn't want to see any more of him after I met him once, quite frankly.
There really is the prospect of a second backup household in season 2, with Elizabeth and Lawrence upstairs and Thomas, Rose and Mrs. Fellows downstairs, but it ends up only being in 2 episodes. And then, of course, what do we do with Thomas? We bring him to be the chauffeur at 165 Eaton Place. As I implied before, the idea that Lawrence is asexual, or possibly a homosexual, is a complete piece of retcon and at odds with what he was doing in Series 1. It puts the spanner in the works of his and Elizabeth's marriage, and of course things are complicated even further by Elizabeth having a baby with Lawrence's substitute, the publisher, which all gets extremely weird and stupid and is rather annoying.
It was very funny when you came into the room in the middle of the episode in which this arrangement is being made, and it made you very surprised and puzzled, and you said to her mum, "Is he asking his publisher to have sex with his wife?"
And of course it was around then that you were very surprised by Lady Marjorie saying Mrs. Curbridge is coming to tea, and then working out through context that Mrs. Curbridge was actually her daughter, but wasn't being talked about like a beloved daughter coming to tea at all. Of course, Lady Marjorie, being the daughter of an earl, really is the most extremely upstairs character of all. And yet, she genuinely cares for and is fond of her servants in their place, and wants to keep them there, happy and well looked after. When King Edward VII is coming to dinner, Lady Marjorie is quite taken aback to see Ruby, the kitchen maid, in the hall. "Ruby, what are you doing here?" Ruby points out we're supposed to be allowed to watch the king coming in from the landing upstairs, and Lady Marjorie is like, "Oh yes, of course you may, go on up." She's a big striking part of the first 2 series, Rachel Gurney as Lady Marjorie Bellamy, née Talbot Carey, as is Nicola Paget as Elizabeth Bellamy, later Curbridge. I do like the bit later in Series 2 where Sir Geoffrey has come to tell Richard and Marjorie that their worries are over. Someone has bought the house and is going to gift it to them. And who is their mysterious benefactor? Elizabeth comes waltzing in going, "It's me!" And Sir Geoffrey is so tickled and smiley, completely at odds with how his character was written, and a much better way to present the character on screen. Another big female presence in those first 2 series is, of course, Pauline Collins as Sarah. I do think those couple of Thomas and Sarah heavy episodes in Series 2 do work very well, but they also illustrate the problem with Thomas as a character that persists in Upstairs Downstairs, and when they try to use him again in a spin-off. Now, when we meet Thomas in the first episode of Series 2, and we see him again in a couple of other early episodes, he is an ambitious character, a cheeky character, a character who can perhaps make people feel a little uncomfortable on occasion, but he doesn't mean any harm by it. He's basically an okay guy, just wanting to get on in the world and look for his chance and work hard to do so along the way. he's really genuinely fond of Rose, and Rose is genuinely fond of him. And when Mr. Hudson makes the mistake of saying, "Oh, we shouldn't have Thomas Watkins, he made Rose cry," Rose is very upset with Mr. Hudson and is quick to make sure that Mr. Hudson goes and admits upstairs that he's made a mistake and they should have Thomas as a chauffeur because he's really okay. Thomas has seen Rose upset and has very much felt for her and gone to comfort her. And after that, we don't really see him doing anything genuinely caring for other people, because they do turn him into this unscrupulous kind of evil character, which I think is a great shame. In the first episode with him and Sarah featured heavily in Series 2, it seems that Thomas is trying to help Lady Marjorie not get blackmailed with letters from the young soldier she had an affair with in Series 1, which is one of those rather stupid episodes that doesn't make a lot of sense emotionally. But of course it turns out Thomas is trying to make a couple of £100 on the side for himself out of the whole deal. And the character really continues from there in the same vein. And at the end of that second series, Thomas and Sarah, John Alderton and Pauline Collins do leave the show together. I was really wondering this time if this was a mutual decision or if they wanted to go or if they were kicked off the show, but there's really no information about why Thomas and Sarah left at that point. Knowing that there was a spin-off from the show called Thomas and Sarah, it would have made a great deal of sense if that had been like Angel with Buffy and had kind of run parallel with Series 3 of Upstairs, Downstairs. But actually, as it turns out, Thomas and Sarah was made 6 or 7 years after John Alderton and Pauline Collins were on Upstairs, Downstairs, 4 years after Upstairs, Downstairs ended. There were lots of proposed spin-offs, and this was the only one that did end up getting made, and it was a complete car crash, really. The tone, the purpose of the show is all over the place, and the characterization of Thomas is all over the place. It works best if Thomas and Sarah are kind of trying to find their way through and help people along the way, as in the school one. But then at other times, Thomas really is the devil incarnate. And I gather that this is really what caused production problems, last-minute rewriting of scripts on Thomas and Sarah, arguments between John Hawksworth, the producer, and John Alderton, who played Thomas, about who is Thomas Watkins. Is he the devil? Is he an okay guy? Is he something in between? Is there any consistency? The answer is no.
Sarah in Upstairs Downstairs is a very interesting character. She is by nature independent and wants to make her own way and feels the unfairness of the class system and doesn't really want to be a servant. She does talk politely to Lady Marjorie, but she also sometimes gets a bit chummy with her and tells her about being punished by the nuns who were educating her when she was a child, and that's one story of hers that rings true. She is a pathological liar and supplies a very accurate assessment of a pathological liar when she's called out on her lies and accused of trying to seem like she's better than the rest of them. She responds, "Not better, just more interested." She gets pregnant by James in Series 2. Both the Bellamy children are making babies with people they shouldn't be. And in that episode with the king, while it's all going on and they've been stressing out over the king coming, trying to get everything exactly right, Sarah turns up in labour and the king mustn't find out. That is a very good episode. Hudson, Gordon Jackson, is very amusing, getting nervous and flapping about the king, and when he wants the seating plan from Rose, she says, "You've got it, Mr. Hudson," and when he says, "Have I?" completely freaking out and at the same time telling the other servants, "No need to be nervous." And that's all working very well, but then it really needs something else to happen at about the time Sarah turns up in labour.
There was a missed opportunity with Ruby at the end of Series 2, I thought. It kind of seemed like she'd worked out that Thomas was really the father of Sarah's baby and hadn't offered to marry her and make an honest woman of her, even though he wasn't the father at all. But then it turned out she'd overheard them talking. I like those occasional moments with Ruby saying something rather astute, just being down to earth and right. She does get mistreated by the other characters and sometimes by the script. Poor old Ruby.
Jenny Thomason as Ruby turns up to series 2 and stays right through to the end. She does take the way she's treated, spoken about in her stride. Gets called stupid a lot, poor thing, but she is very good at her job. People say when she does get the opportunity to cook something that it's been very good. Surprisingly good custard, Ruby, and apple dumplings.
She really is a good, plain cook, and the children in Mr. and Mrs. Hudson's guest house are going to very much enjoy her custard and other concoctions as well, I'm sure. The other really memorable thing, I think, in Series 2 is Miss Elizabeth and her suffragette stuff, and Rose getting rather unwisely involved and ending up in prison being force-fed porridge through a tube while Elizabeth gets off scot-free. We found it hard to feel very sorry for Rose, though, because she really was interfering far too much and shouldn't have gone rushing after Miss Lizzie and getting herself into that situation. Rachel Gurney and Nicola Paget really spoil all their plans for Series 3 by both wanting to leave, but it does kind of add some new life to the show, something different, with Hazel and Georgina really turning up to take their places. They take the opportunity, of course, to use the Titanic to get rid of Lady Marjorie, which provides some memorable scenes, particularly giving Patsy Smart as Miss Roberts the chance to do something rather different from anything she's done in the first 2 series, talking about her experiences leaving the Titanic and having to abandon Lady Marjorie to her fate.
Miss Roberts isn't in it that much, of course. She's Lady Marjorie's lady's maid, which is why she was on the Titanic with her. And when she turns up on the doorstep, having gone a bit mad, losing sight of Lady Marjorie on the Titanic and getting forced into a lifeboat and having to row away from the ship, I was around when our mum was watching this on the telly, and I was thinking, who the hell is this? Never seen her before. Why does she know about what's happened to Lady Marjorie? And that reminds me of Piers, the groom-turned-chauffeur, played by Brian Osborne, just a few times. And it's not really gone into explicitly, but the first time you see him, he's got some horses to look after, and then not long after that, he's driving the car and looking after the car, which isn't really the same thing at all, but as far as upstairs is concerned, it is, because he's the guy who helps them get about. And it's a very good idea to replace him with Thomas, because Piers wants to be with horses, really, and he goes to be head groom in another household, so he gets a very nice happy ending.
Yeah, it is interesting whenever we see the mews and the garage, as it becomes, used to be the stables. Thomas lives there in Series 2. Edward and Daisy live there as a married couple in Series 5, while Edward is the chauffeur. You can see that it really has horse stalls and hay troughs and things, but now they're using it to keep the car.
What they do with the Titanic is actually quite irritating. Roberts has to have this story about Lady Marjorie going off to help a child look for her parents. Otherwise, as everyone knows, she would have been one of the first of the boats. But apparently it's done for the whole rest of her family as well, including her brother, who had been Earl Southwold for 2 years. He died childless, and it's briefly mentioned when someone thinks of it. Lady Marjorie's and his cousin is now Earl Southwold, and that's a real shame. And we keep on saying, why not just say he had a son? Georgina has a stepbrother. It seems to be because someone thought, well, if Georgina had anyone left from that branch of the family, why would she come to live at 165 Eaton Place? But I think you could make that make perfect sense. She and her stepbrother met later in childhood, adolescence. She doesn't feel particularly comfortable living in the big house on the estate with him. She'd rather live somewhere smaller, with people that she connects with a bit more. And then when there's any talk of having to sell the house, instead of, oh, but what would happen to Georgina, they could say, well, Georgina could always go back to her stepbrother, even though it's not her favourite place to live. I just find it very irritating the way they bring these noble families to an abrupt halt. They also do it with Bunny and Diana. Bunny is the Marquis of Newbury. Diana is one of a few people that James has loved and would have quite liked to marry, only he chooses Hazel over Diana, so she marries Bunny and is awful to him, and they don't have a very good marriage, and down the line, at some point, she says, oh, they'd be very happy if he could divorce me and marry someone who produce an heir. And again, there's no reason not to say they have a son. It would be very in character for Diana to say, oh dear, I never connected with my baby son. I never really got into being Bunny's wife, and that's part of it.
The only explanation we get for who is the new Lord Southwold is Richard saying Marjorie's cousin. Really, it would be much better if he said Marjorie's nephew, and they incorporated that character as you were suggesting. As I spotted when our mum was watching it on ITV2, by all laws of succession that usually take place, James should be Lord Southwold. He is the grandson of the Lord Southwold who is incumbent up until 1910. If that Lord Southwold's son has died, that Lord Southwold's oldest daughter's son should then be Lord Southwold. That's what would happen in the line of succession to the throne or something like that. For it to make sense that James isn't Lord Southwold, it should be Marjorie's younger brother Hugo's son, Marjorie's nephew, Georgina's older stepbrother who really has nothing to do with her, and she doesn't feel comfortable living on the estate of. Poor old Hazel Bellamy, née Forrest, played by Meg Wynne Owen. Our mother couldn't actually remember when she was watching the repeats whether Hazel was married to James or Richard Bellamy. And actually, poor woman, she was married to James. But it's very easy to see why you might come away not being sure which she was married to, because Richard is the one she's mainly in the house with, talking to, and they are supporting each other like a married couple, except they're really father-in-law and daughter-in-law, rather like Jim Robinson and Helen Daniels on Neighbours, being mother-in-law and son-in-law and kind of acting as parents together to Jim's children. It's really the First World War that prolongs James and Hazel's marriage. That breaks out at the end of Series 3, because during Series 3 they have a terrible marriage. It does make sense, I was saying this time, that Richard and Hazel do connect on a certain level. They've both been born middle class and have married above them, and in many ways have felt like a fish out of water at times. Richard finds it very frustrating still, having the Southwold family feeling that they can direct him, control what he's doing as an MP. That marrying above his social station is still a part of his life, and he very much sympathises with Hazel, feeling rather out of her depth, particularly as James is so awful to her. We were rather annoyed by the second episode in Series 3 with Bunny and Diana, which is called The Bolter, where James had been absolutely awful to Hazel when she'd come away to spend the weekend with his stupid friends, and then the script kind of forgot that he'd been awful to her because she thought he'd gone off to have extramarital sex with Diana, but actually he hadn't. So the fact that he hadn't meant, oh, it's all right, everything's fine between James and Hazel. But the real issue was James had treated her like absolute dirt in private and in front of all his stupid friends, and she'd been understandably devastated and gone running home to be comforted by Richard. It really shows James in a very bad light, that series and that marriage. And Hazel's journey through series 3 and 4, from being rather looked down on by the servants, not wanting to serve her lunch in the dining room with James, she's only a typist, she shouldn't be in the dining room, through earning their trust by her careful handling of Miss Roberts after the Titanic, through escaping from her controlling mother who's convinced her James won't want to marry her because she's had a previous unwise, dissolved marriage, but then actually marrying James and him becoming absolutely horrible, through being a war wife and worried about what James is up to fighting in the war, but really she's much better off with him not in the house. It just doesn't feel like it to her at the time because he's off fighting the war.
It did amuse us, Hazel's father telling James what would be on the certificate when they got married. Hazel Patricia O'Connor née Forrest. Even though he might not have liked Patricia as a middle name for his daughter, it would be the O'Connor bit that would worry James.
I read that the producers and Meg Wynne-Owen both agreed that Hazel, poor, dowdy, depressed, downtrodden Hazel, really had no place in the roaring 20s and therefore would have to die in the Spanish flu pandemic after the war. Actually, Hazel is the main character who doesn't quite make it to the end of the First World War. She dies a few days before armistice, which does make her journey very sad, really. She doesn't make a lot of progress towards happiness or really finding a place in the Bellamy household or really in the show. I do feel very sorry for her, and I do think perhaps she's underused or misused to some extent.
Another character who's introduced in Series 3 is Daisy. She's the underhouse parlourmaid who actually sticks with it for a while. She becomes head house parlourmaid when Rose is lady's maid to Virginia. She's played by Jacqueline Tong and is introduced along with Georgina, and they kind of start bonding over being the same age, and in some ways you get the impression Daisy's not really used to being a servant, but it's also stated at some point that she's had another position for the last couple of years, so another bit of continuity issue there. I got the feeling that it was decided that Daisy should marry Edward for the sake of the drama, the storyline, so that when Edward is at the front, he's got a wife at home worrying about him. Jacqueline Tong and Christopher Beanie have chemistry, and they're both very good actors. They allow you to believe in the relationship and buy into Daisy worrying about my Eddie at the front and later on being shell-shocked. And at that point I pointed out there really is a third persona to Edward, the one who's gone to the front and been forced to grow up and take things seriously. There's a scene where Richard finds him crying on the stairs, and one may joke, oh no, he'll think he's pregnant, because that happened to one of the underhouse parlourmaids in a black and white episode. Christopher Beanie does a very good job of something quite challenging, trying to continue in that professional persona that Edward has and be a bit mortified that someone upstairs is so concerned about him, but also be shell-shocked and be honest about how he's feeling.
When Georgina's larking about, having rather too much fun and not really knowing what to do with her life during the 20s, I always say it's a shame she never really goes back to her original intention of helping the poor, but then perhaps it's something she'll do in future as Marchioness of Stockbridge. And of course it's quite right that Daisy is in that situation, a housekeeper. Georgina and Daisy do belong together, having made that connection the first time they met when they were both 18. And what a lot Leslie Ann Down as Georgina Worsley does add to the show as well. The first thing I can really remember noticing about her is that she looks so natural in the 20s fashions with the cloche hat and the dresses without waist, and she is always trailing cigarette smoke, holding her cigarette in one of those long holders, and I thought, oh, she really suits this historical time period. But then later, when I came across that production of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, starring Anthony Hopkins and Leslie Ann Down, I realised it's not just the 20s. She is a chameleon, metaphorically speaking. I was thinking, now who is this playing Esmeralda? I'm sure I know her. And then I realised it's Leslie Ann Down, looking just as natural in her Dark Ages French gypsy costume. And it's true, she looks like a schoolgirl when she first appears, although the long hair that they give her, child's hair, might be overdoing it a bit.
and she looks very natural as a war nurse, which is a very major thing that she does. And in fact, what they did with that reminded me of Rilla of Ingleside, which is the last Anne of Green Gables sequel, and Rilla is Anne's daughter, who likes larking around and going to parties and thinks, oh, the war hasn't really got anything to do with us. And then as she experiences the war, in Rilla's case, it's got to do with her brothers going to the front, and in Georgina's case, translating for the Belgian refugees that come to stay in the house, and seeing the wounded soldiers on the platform and giving them cigarettes, and then going and doing her nursing, she comes of age and improves herself through experiencing these things firsthand and realizing that there's more to life than larking about, and some things are actually very serious.
And that really is what Series 4 is about, the First World War. Apparently it's the most popular, best thought of, most critically acclaimed series because of how it handles the First World War and puts the characters into it. And I think it certainly does benefit the series to have that focus. You don't get so many random, silly episodes. Thinking about the war, it's really time to mention James and Georgina, who have a very strange, awkward, hard-to-place relationship on the show. Even back on ITV2, I thought something like, well, if James was ever going to be happy by marrying someone, it would be Georgina. But perhaps, really, he's not capable of being a good husband or being happy or making anyone else happy. The acid test would be if Georgina did agree to marry him. But of course, she doesn't want to marry him. But she also doesn't completely feel unromantic towards him. And so they do have some very strange, awkward, painful interactions at times.
There was a bit that rather epitomised the whole thing, where Georgina's saying to James, I do love you, Jumbo, and I said, like a brother. And you said, a brother you've met in your 20s who you have GSA with.
I really think that's the closest anyone's ever got to summing up their relationship accurately, and I think it does show how awkward it is. So much so that it's really revisited in the build-up to James's suicide in the penultimate episode of the series, although of course the main cause of that is the Wall Street crash. It was watching Series 5 that I was really thinking about Quantum Leap because, as I said on our Quantum Leap podcast, when we were watching Season 5 of Quantum Leap, I was thinking, well, this isn't a bad episode, but we've seen it done before, better, more appropriately, earlier in the series, a lot of the time. And I was thinking the same thing during Series 5 of Upstairs, Downstairs. A lot of it was very familiar and kind of more appropriately placed in previous forms in previous series. A particular example was Virginia Bellamy getting involved, though not sexually like Lady Marjorie did, with another man. In this case, he was played by Robert Hardy, a very familiar actor who's done a lot of entertaining turns in a lot of shows and films over the years. And you were being struck that Georgina and Robert's marriage and barriers to getting married and chatting about whether they were going to do it and stumbling about and annoying us was rather reminding you of Elizabeth and Lawrence in some ways.
Yes, both season finales, they're doing that, and then suddenly she's got on a wedding dress and they're getting married.
I do like Hannah Gordon as Virginia.
She does bring with her her children, Alice and William, for sadly too few episodes. Her other child, Michael, was killed in the war, and there's a whole episode about him being court-martialed for cowardice, and Sir Geoffrey stepping in to help, and the military court being rather fazed in the presence of a real lawyer. And that's all rather complicated, but the upshot is that he gets a slap on the wrist for funking it whilst being suddenly in command of this vessel that's under attack, and when he next goes into battle, he dies bravely and goes down fighting. And there's a bit where William is reading a storybook, adventure story, about a ship being shot at and going down, and asks, is that what happened to Michael, Mummy? And she says, well, yes, darling, more or less. They have a very nice, pleasant, loving parent-child relationship. Of course, when Virginia and Alice are standing next to each other, Virginia has to have on a rather tall hat because Alice, who's about 11 most of the time we see her, is as tall as Hannah Gordon.
I've always thought it's a bit of a rotten piece of emotional blackmail. James, Georgina, and eventually the two children emotionally blackmailing Virginia into living at 165 Eaton Place and getting another 11 years, one TV season out of the whole setup. But it does always strike me the show does need Virginia, Alice, and William to be upstairs. They've been struggling for a while, really, to have enough upstairs characters. And the good thing about Alice and William is they do add new situations, a new type of character to the show that makes some memorable Series 5 episodes. But only 3 of them. William and Alice are in episodes 1, 3, and 5, being the children in the house, and you don't see William again after that. Alice is on location for Georgina and Robert's wedding in the final episode of the series, episode 16. She's one of the bridesmaids. Everybody does a very good job of standing in front of her, I'm sure not on purpose, and she's quite hard to spot. Chronologically, she should be 22 at that point. Really, the actress they hired, Anne Yarker was her name, it's probably about the best you could do for wanting a playing age of 11 to 22 within one series. William is played by an actor called Jonathan Seeley. But seeing Alice and William around the house in those 3 episodes, enjoying themselves in the kitchen, talking to the servants, challenging Ruby to say pussy with her mouth full of toffee, just adds so much to the show and brings the house to life in such a tangible way. And then when you don't see them for most of the series, but the script occasionally tries to convince us that Master William and Miss Alice and Thimble the dog are still around sometimes, it really doesn't wash, and we miss seeing them. And that aspect of the show that's fleshed it out so much in a new, interesting way in this final series really is missing. James is suggesting getting William up from Eton to look after this 16-year-old girl who's coming to visit. William should be about 13 at the time. We'd like to see that, wouldn't we? You might feel rather awkward about the situation, but of course we don't get to see that sort of thing after we've been teased with those 3 episodes of Alice and William. And they are memorable episodes, of course, the first one being that emotional blackmail of Virginia. We see James truly happy playing with William and the train set.
The train set is one of those props that won't play ball like a lot of the curtains. The locomotive really sort of sticks and collapses if you try and put anything on it to pull. The episode with Thimble the dog, in which William goes off to his prep school and Thimble is obtained in order to cheer Alice up and stop her from being lonely, is a very good one. It has an evil governess. It's pretty evil to say when Virginia and Richard are away, that dog is a bad influence on Alice, I'm going to have it humanely disposed of. I did think Thimble was at least going to nip her in self-defence when she was whacking him with the shoe he'd been chewing or something. And the servants hide Thimble in the mews until Virginia and Richard return. And there's this camaraderie between them and Miss Alice, which is all very nice. And Hudson in that episode is telling them Miss Treadwell's been left in charge, you have to stop complaining about her. And then when she's telling him, I'm going to get that dog put down, you can see in his face, this is going too far, I'm going to have to do something about this. But of course he maintains his professionalism and doesn't threaten Miss Treadwell with not letting her do it, which is the most sensible thing in that situation. Seem to accept it and then go off and make your own plans without anyone suspecting you.
During that episode in particular, I wasn't thinking about Quantum Leap at all. I wasn't thinking, well, we've seen this before, because we haven't. It was completely uncharted territory for Upstairs Downstairs, and what a shame. It was also the end of that kind of episode. When Miss Treadwell turned up, I thought she might be going to sidestep that character archetype of being the unreasonable governess. She says in episode 3 she was engaged to a soldier who died in the war. She's not unfeeling, she has certain sympathies. But then she's very much the antagonist in episode 5. Of course, you get a thoughtful moment at the end. William has written from his prep school to say, "Thank Treddy, Miss Treadwell, for the funny postcard that she sent him to help him settle in. She wasn't all bad, but in the end, she was too bad." There were a couple of new servants. We'd actually seen one of them in a guest role before in season 4, joining the show in season 5. I mentioned Lily, who was played by Karen Dotrice. She's there for a while as the under-house parlourmaid. And there's also Frederick, played by Gareth Hunt, and he's the new footman. He and Edward have a kind of footman rivalry, because really that's Edward's expertise, even though he's now the chauffeur. And Frederick first appeared when everyone thought James had been killed in the war, as Trooper Norton. He was James's batman in the army. He has a slightly longer character arc than Lily, which ends up with him going off to seek his fortune, maybe in America. And that was one of the proposed spin-offs, Frederick in America. It sounds the least kind of workable to me of all the proposed spin-offs, because it doesn't really have a lot to do with Upstairs, Downstairs.
I did think that was a silly way to write him out. It's very much implied that he's going to be a sort of escort, gigolo, jobbing actor kind of thing, which seems a rather peculiar choice. And the way that Lily is written out is also rather silly. Hudson, it would seem, falls in love with her, has been led to believe that she wants to marry him, which she doesn't, so she leaves her post to save any awkwardness or anything to do with Hudson perhaps wanting to leave. Both characters that they introduced you read to fill in spaces vacated by James and Rose, who weren't planning to be in it that much, but actually, even if they were in it a little bit less than before, you don't really notice.
And it wasn't even that Frederick and Lily were there when James and Rose weren't. Really, in the last few episodes, you get quite a bit of Mrs. Bridges, Edward and Daisy hanging around in the kitchen chatting. James has gone off to America to sulk because Georgina won't marry him. Virginia disappears for long periods in Series 5. Of course, we're not allowed to see the children anymore as they grow into young adults. It's looking rather sparse before everyone, except William, comes back for the end, to be sent off for their happy endings, or in James's case, suicide. So there's an end to our Upstairs, Downstairs podcast. But do join us again next time, which will be the final Sunday in December, which this year just happens to be New Year's Eve, for a podcast on
some Roald Dahl adaptations, primarily The Witches. That is the 1990 version, not the more recent one.
Until then, good night out there.
Whatever you are.